Hello class, welcome to our techniques lecture number 4, vertical pushing and pulling. So lecture number 3 was on horizontal pushing and pulling. Now we're going to look vertically. So our vertical push variations are going to be the overhead press. So moving our barbell from a front rack position to above our head, and then the dip, which is going to be a vertical where we are pressing down, pushing down in order to move our body up. So these are two vertical push variations that we can load heavily and are slightly different in the way that they're recruited, but they're both looking at the vertical plane. With our vertical pull variations, we're going to focus on the chin up and the pull up. Chin up being specifically the hands facing towards the body, pull up where the palms are facing away from the body. They're slightly different in their setup and execution and their muscle recruitment. And we'll talk about how to set up for each a little bit later. So today we'll talk about our overhead push first, the overhead press. The overhead press, similar to our bench press variations, we're going to use a similar grip width, maybe slightly closer depending on the athlete's range of motion and their ability to maintain that front racked position. So I'll likely use about a half a thumb's width away from the edge of the knurling to a full thumb's width depending on the athlete's range of motion. The difference here between our horizontal and our vertical press is in this case, we are in a stable closed chain foot position, but we're moving our body and our arms freely without a stable bench. So we have less stability, which limits the amount of resistance we are able to move within the exercise. Because we are not using the legs as a driver for this overhead press, it makes it more difficult for us to overload the same way or load to the same extent that we can with other exercises. But the transfer is there similar to our horizontal row. We are maintaining a stable foot position, maintaining a stable pelvis as we move our arms in space. So our overhead press variation, we set up with our grip width. We rack that bar into similar to a front rack position, but we are holding the bar with a vertical forearm at the collarbone level, pressing. As we press, we need to extend the thoracic spine slightly and bring the head into some upper cervical extension so that we can really move the bar without hitting ourselves in the chin. So we set up, lock in the abdominals, lock in the glutes, give a little bit of extension, press, and come back through. We're keeping that vertical forearm throughout the movement pattern. Vertical forearm is key for our pressing movements. And then we have to upwardly rotate the scapula in order to allow us to press that bar overhead. Many athletes will not be able to press bilaterally overhead, but can press unilaterally overhead. So unilaterally, we get a little bit more room for error as opposed to a bilateral overhead press. So progress it as such. Normally in my linear progression, I start the athletes with a bilateral dumbbell overhead press until they're able to press 25-pound dumbbells over their head for 3 sets of 5. Then we can move to the barbell and start progressing with the barbell. Because you do lose some degrees of freedom, some chance to move with the barbell as opposed to the dumbbell with overhead pressing variations. And we do have to perform that upward rotation, which is critical to having a safe shoulder. Many athletes do not start with overhead pressing very early, don't do a lot of overhead pressing, lose strength with upward rotation, which can lead to issues with the shoulder joint later on in life. The other vertical variation is the dip. I would categorize the dip similar to the pull-up in that it is more of a body weight movement. However, you're using your hands to stabilize yourself and the feet are not on the ground. So this is using the upper extremity as your major stabilizer rather than using the foot against the ground, which does have transferred to sport, especially if you're in sports where you are having to place a hand on the ground, manipulate your hand on the ground, combat sports, where you have that body movement where you have to use your hands to stabilize yourself and hold your body weight. the dip is a great variation there. Something to focus on with the dip from a safety standpoint. Okay, the dip can cause some issues with the shoulder if we do not perform the dip correctly and if we perform the dip too frequently. So we want to be able to shift our weight back up in that same position. We want to get to about where the shoulder and the elbow are at the same height, or the shoulder is slightly below, depending on your athlete's range of motion, your athlete's ability. We want to retract the shoulder blades first and get a little bit of that posterior tilt so we have a stable scapular position before we start to move the humerus. If we are in an anterior scapular tilt, so that's where our shoulders are up and rolled forward, we're going to lose some of that ability. We also get some recruitment from the latissimus dorsi as well as the pectoralis major to perform that adduction with the humerus, to bring it back to that midline as the humerus moves from behind the body to in line with the body. With this movement, we're able to press down, lift our body weight up. We don't want the shoulders to move up towards the ears and tilt forward. That's where we're going to see a lot of damage and errors with the dip if we're not performing scapular depression and retraction throughout the exercise. So that's something to focus on when you are coaching your dip variation for your athletes, making sure that they're in a stable scapular position. Starting with just dip position holds is a great way to progress your athletes. Start in that holding position, work your way into dips. You can use feet supported dips as a regression. So you maybe place a box, the athlete keeps their feet on there, and they add their assistance to themselves as much as they need until they can perform a body weight dip. And then we can begin adding resistance to the body to increase the overload within the exercise. Okay. Similarly with the dip and the chin up, we are using our hands as our major point of stability, and our legs are free to move within space. Okay. With the chin up, we start with an underhand grip just outside shoulder width, and we perform a vertical pull, so bringing our arms from overhead to our side. We don't want the shoulders to move up, similar to what we talked about in the dip just a second ago. We don't want the shoulders to move up towards the ears. We don't want the head to shoot into forward head posture. We want to keep a stable posture while we move our shoulder girdle and our arms in space. We do not want to cross our legs. We don't want to move our knees if we don't have to. Okay? And we want to row as high as our body allows us to. Okay? Some athletes may be able to only pull to the top of their head before they start to compensate. Start there and move their way up. Okay? We don't want our athletes moving their chin over the bar just for the sake of getting the chin over the bar. When they're strong enough, they're able to actually pull their entire body up above the bar and back down, shooting for the collarbone as our point of maximal pull before the variation starts to change. Okay, but this does allow for humeral extension. It does allow the supinated grip position with external rotation at the shoulder. You're going to be stronger in the chin up as opposed to the pull-up variation because you're able to recruit the biceps to a greater degree. You're able to perform more humeral extension rather than adduction. So you're going to be likely stronger within the chin up variation when it comes to a loading perspective compared to the pull-up variation, which we'll talk about now. With the pull-up variation, we're using an overhand grip, similar width just outside of the shoulder, and we are rowing to that same position that we did with our chin up. Okay, so we do not want to shoot for a forward head posture. We want to bring our body as high as we can and come back down all the way through. You'll often see athletes shorten their range of motion, either from a lack of range of motion or because they're not strong enough to handle pulling their body from a fully overhead position. So starting in that position and beginning with eccentric exercise using partner assisted. You can use box assisted to help the athlete get their pull-ups. I don't recommend using bands because it does change the level of the strength curve. So with a band, it gets easier at the top and harder, or it gets easier from the bottom and then it gets harder at the top. With the chin up or the pull up, you are strongest at the top and weakest at the bottom. But you're never getting that same overload in the middle where it's the most disadvantaged position when the elbow is at 90 degrees, the humerus is at 90 degrees to the body. That is going to be the hardest point within that curve. They're in the middle of the movement. You'll be able to pull a little bit to, most athletes can pull to that point or pull up from that point, but transitioning past it is the most difficult point. So adding in different variations where the athlete has to work to get that range of motion, work to successfully complete the lift is going to give us the best transfer. All right, so think of our topics for discussion: similarities, differences, progressions that you can think of, range of motion abilities, loading, muscle actions, and think about it from a programming standpoint, because these vertical movements are necessary within our life and within sport. If you're picking up something overhead, loss of overhead range of motion is a big issue as we age. So the ability to reach up and to stabilize objects over our head is going to give us a better chance to be able to interact with our environment as we age. Same with getting out of a chair. As you age and maybe you have to use your arms or you have to catch yourself from a fall, being able to vertically apply force downward towards the ground can give you the ability to maybe catch yourself from a fall or stop yourself from falling when you've maybe slipped or tripped. And you'll be able to interact with your environment to a greater extent. Within sport, being able to reach overhead, being able to pull in swimming, hold objects overhead, throw and perform overhead movements with a stable, safe shoulder comes from being able to perform vertical pushes and pulls as well as horizontal pushing and pulling movement patterns. So being able to use the upper extremity throughout its range of motion with a safe and stable shoulder joint. All right, thank you very much for watching, and let's have some great discussion.